Preach it.
I'm going to start the morning message off just a little differently. Normally, if you've heard me preach, then you know I like to start with an amusing story or a cute little joke. But what I'm going to read this morning really isn't a cute little story. It's poignant, and this story was published just a few weeks ago, July 29th, in the issue of the Bakersfield, Californian newspaper. And someone was nice enough to send this to me, and it really touched my heart. Let me read it to you. Don and Maxine Simpson were married for 62 years, and not even death could keep them apart for long. According to the couple's granddaughter, Melissa Sloan, the Simpsons of Bakersfield, California, passed away approximately 4 hours apart on the morning of July 21st. Maxine, 87, had suffered from bladder cancer, while 90-year-old Don had struggled with Alzheimer's disease and suffered a broken hip and pneumonia in the week before his death. The couple had lived in Bakersfield since the early 1950s, though neither were California natives. They were introduced by mutual friends at a local bowling alley. Don proposed 6 months later, and they were married in 1952. After the marriage, the two traveled to Germany, where Don worked as a civil engineer for the U.S. Army. While there, the two adopted 2 sons from a German orphanage. After they returned to Bakersfield, Don ran his own civil engineering firm, while Maxine worked as a nurse. In early June, the ailing couple moved in with Sloan in order to be near family. Don had entered the hospital for treatment on his broken hip and pneumonia, but Sloan had him moved back into her home on July 19th and placed his bed next to his wife, Maxine. Maxine died at 7 a.m. on the 21st. At 10 a.m., as her body was being taken from the room, Sloan noticed her grandfather's breathing was becoming labored. Within the hour, he was dead as well. When her body left the room, Sloan told the Bakersfield Californian, his soul left with her. Isn't that a beautiful story? What gripped me when I read this, the words of the daughter. When her body left the room, his soul left with her. Is that possible? Did this really happen? Now, I'm certain when people were reading this, there were some who embraced it right away and said, yes, this is exactly how it happened. And of course, there were skeptics who probably said, well, this is a nice story, but I doubt very much that it happened quite this way. Got me to thinking about the message, and well, there are people out there, and they're looking for answers. They are searching, and they want something to believe in. And so many are frightened of the unknown, and let's face it, death is the unknown. If you've lost someone, you certainly want to know, are they really in a better place? Is there something beyond the physical? So this morning I thought I would tackle this difficult topic. It's difficult because death is not the topic we enjoy talking about. For some, they would just as soon ignore death, hoping that somehow it's going to bypass them. But it never does. And we're all touched by this reality. We've lost loved ones. We've been to funeral homes. We've attended memorial services for people that we know and that we have appreciated. But as Christians, this really should not be a difficult subject. We know, don't we, that there is something beyond physical death, and we should talk about it occasionally. We need to talk about it and share the hope that we have with others who are struggling, who are quite frankly afraid. We need to talk about this topic, and it helps us confront our own fears. And there's nothing wrong with struggling and possibly being fearful. I'll let you in on a little secret. Your pastor has struggled with this. I've laid awake at night, at times, thinking about my own end. What exactly will take place at that moment? So, let's get metaphysical this morning and help one another. And the first question we want to ask ourselves is, what is next? What is next? What happens after this life is over with? What exactly is death? Here's a true story. A young pastor would give the children's sermon. It was a special time when all the kids would come up and sit around the platform, and the pastor would sit down with them and would have some sort of little story. And this particular morning he began with a question. If I sold my house and my car, had a big garage sale, and gave all my money to the church, would I get into heaven? And the children all in one accord said, no! If I cleaned the church every day, mowed the yard and kept everything neat and tidy, would I get into heaven? And again the response from all the children were, no! Well, then, how can I get to heaven? There was silence for a moment, then a little 5-year-old boy shouted out, you gotta be dead! And I'm sure the response from the congregation then was one of laughter. So back to our scripture lesson this morning in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, the first verse that was read. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared. Now, this is St. John's vision. A new world has opened to his view. And keep in mind, this is a vision. He hasn't died. God is giving him a sneak preview of what is to come. Boy, what a blessing to have a sneak preview. And he saw, the Bible tells us, a new heaven and a new earth. He saw a new universe. Think with me, it's always been there. He just couldn't see it. It's still there. We can't see it. But it's there, and it's waiting for us. It's a world beyond us. It's God's kingdom. It's for all those who believe and trust in Christ and serve him. Now, there's a number of reasons why John was allowed this miraculous vision. It was a way of encouraging him. He was in exile on the Isle of Patmos. He was being punished because he was a believer. He was a Christian. He was a follower. Banished to this barren island. And can you imagine being alone and wondering what is going to happen next? Am I going to die? Is my ministry over with? All the things that we've been trying to do to share the good news of Jesus, is it all going down the tubes? Is it all a waste of time? And so God, in his mercy and his grace, he gives John this glorious vision to encourage him, to allow him to be strengthened in his heart and soul so he can continue on to be the missionary that God has called him to be. And to let him know that in the end, God wins. You see, friends, God always wins. And when we're followers, we always win with him. I think this is the way that God's speaking to us and answering the questions that we have, that we struggle with about life and what takes place after that. This is what is next. Men and women who have gone on are given glorified bodies, suited for a place that is pure and light and glorious. A new universe. It's always been there. It's a world beyond ours. It's waiting for us. In Philippians chapter 1, a couple of verses, St. Paul writes this: "For to me living is for Christ, and dying is even better. Yet if I live, that means fruitful service for Christ. I really don't know which is better. I'm torn between two desires. Sometimes I want to live, and sometimes I long to go and be with Christ. That would be far better for me." We're on a collision course with this amazing event. A few years ago, there was a very popular book out, penned by Rick Warren. Maybe some of you read it, The Purpose-Driven Life. Very popular, sold millions of copies, made Rick Warren very rich. And I was one of the people who bought a copy, and it's in my library. And I can still remember opening it and reading the first chapter, the very first sentence of the book. He starts out like this: "Today, the average lifespan is 25,550 days. That's how long you will live if you are typical." Well, I don't know about you, but I got my calculator out. Okay, let's see. I've been around this long, that many years, times 360. And I got to the figure, and I was depressed. Oh man, that's all I got left? I sure hope I'm more than typical. We're on a collision course. We're on that final event in our life. Let's call it our departure adventure. We're all going to experience it. It can really be an exciting moment, this transition. And if I picked up anything in this message from St. Paul, in the passage I read from Philippians, it's that we should not be afraid. Yeah, I still want to be alive. I mean, there's something natural about fighting the will to live. No one wants to die. I don't. And so we struggle with it, and yet we have to struggle with it, keeping in mind that, boy, but there's something so good waiting for me. I want to stay, but I want to go. When Paul wrote this, he'd been a missionary for over 30 years, and he was an elderly man, and he knew that his time was drawing to a close, and he had been successful as a missionary. He'd witnessed miracles. He had preached the gospel. He had sacrificed for the Lord. He had known good days and bad days, and so many churches had been started under his ministry. He had every right to feel good about his life, and yet maybe hoping just a little while longer, Lord. Now, I admit I am no St. Paul, but in the 30 plus years that I've been in ministry, looking back, God has used me. I pastored now, this is my 5th church, and He's put me in places where I could preach and where I could help people, and there were some good days and there have been some bad days. There have been ups and downs, disappointments, some glorious victories, and I look back and I think, this has been good. And I want it to last. I don't want it to end. But I know there's going to be an ending. Paul's reminding us that we all face that day. And we're going to enter into a new world, and we should not be afraid. He said, I long to go and be with Christ. And that brings me to question number 2. Let's make it personal. What about me? Revelation 21:2 says, and I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven like a beautiful bride prepared for her husband. What about me? What about you? And again, St. John is given this sneak preview, and he sees a place that's and he compares it to seeing a beautiful bride prepared for her husband. On February the 24th, 1968, I stood on the platform at St. Paul United Church of Christ in Taylor. It was my wedding day. I was scared to death. I'd heard about knees knocking. My knees were literally knocking. I remember I was trembling inside. I looked over at my best man. He had a silly grin on his face. That didn't help any. Not very reassuring. I mean, I've been single for 21 years of my life. It was the only life I knew. And now everything was about to change. And I was scared and wondering about the future. And then my bride walked in, escorted by her father. She was dressed in this white wedding gown. She was a vision of beauty. I saw her walk, and it took my breath away. And suddenly, I wasn't scared anymore. She was going to be my wife. And at that very moment, I remember thinking, I am the luckiest man in the world. The words of St. John are a real comfort when we think about our own death. Death is not a negative. Death is a personal experience of gain. When we see for the first time heaven, it will be like a beautiful bride. It'll take our breath away. And suddenly all the fear will vanish. It's gone. But right now, in this life, it's hard for us to comprehend this. It's hard to picture it in our mind. Someone sent me an email not long ago. I have a friend from my Romulus church. His name is Fred. I won't tell you his last name. You might know him. Drives me nuts. He's constantly sending me emails. I mean, every morning I get up and open my email box, and there it is, flooded with messages from Fred. Well, actually, they're not his messages. He's sending me stories left and right. I don't have time for this, Fred. Please stop filling up my box. He finally sends me one, though. I read it and I liked it. Thank you, Fred. 1 out of 100, and it's good. And it caught my attention, so I opened it, and it was called Children's Prayers and Pledges. And in this little article, parents are reporting amusing stories about their children when they're very young, something that they've said or experienced, okay? So, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, real fast. Parents, let me find my place. Okay, here it is. Okay. This is from a parent who lives in Montana. My son, who is in nursery school, said, "Our Father, who art in heaven, how did you know my name?" From Tampa, Florida. When my husband was 6 years old, he thought the Apostles' Creed went, "He suffered under a bunch of violets." From Colorado. When I was younger, I believed the line was, "Lead a snot into temptation." I thought I was praying for my little sister to get into trouble. From Ohio. When I was little, I often wondered who Richard Stans was. You know, I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for Richard Stans. From Massachusetts. My mother spent her early childhood saying, "Hail Mary, full of grapes." And another one from Ohio. I remember thinking this prayer was, "Give us this day our jelly bread." And finally, the last one, and this was not in the article, this was something from our own family. Our son Jason, when he was in Sunday school, he would sing this out with gusto. He's got the puny little brothers in his hands. Remember that? The kids, they just don't get it quite right, do they? But when we get to heaven, we will have it all complete. We'll have the full picture. We will finally understand, because God has given us new eyes, a new vision. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13:12, "Now we see things imperfectly, as a poor mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity." So, I don't know what your idea of heaven is going to be like, but when you get there, you're going to find out you were probably off base a little bit. Probably not quite what you imagined. Always better. And your new home, it's going to take your breath away. Paul said, "For me, living is for Christ, and dying is even better." Even Paul realized that he was probably underestimating everything. He thought he had a handle on it, but I'm probably falling short. He couldn't imagine until his eyes were opened. God peeled away that film that was preventing him from seeing the total picture. Friends, our death is our gain for God's glory. This brings me to my last question. What should I do? Revelation 21:5. "And the one sitting on the throne said, 'Look, I am making all things new.' Then he said to me, 'Write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true.'" Now this is what John had to do. He's grappling with this vision. And so God speaks to him and says, "John, write it down. I'm making all things new." Listen how the Peterson translation reads. It really gives a freshness to this passage. "I heard a voice thunder from the throne. 'Look, look! God has moved into the neighborhood, making his home with men and women. They're his people. He's their God. He'll wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death is gone for good. Tears gone. Crying gone. Pain gone. All the first order of things gone. Look, I am making everything new. Write it down." So what should we do? Well, I think what God is saying to us in this passage is, first of all, we need to adjust our attitude a bit. At least that was the case with St. John. In a sense, God was saying to John, don't be so uptight about the future. I've got everything under control. John, you're going to be all right. We have to have the right attitude as believers, especially when it comes to this topic of death. In Philippians 1:23, again, Paul writes this, "I'm torn between two desires. Sometimes I want to live, sometimes I long to go to be with Christ. That would be far better for me, but it is better for you that I live." Now this is not escapism. This is not a man who's in personal denial. Paul did not have a death wish. It was just that he had this close relationship with God, and from time to time he would think about heaven, think about what was waiting for him. But then he would shake it off and he would continue on, going on, doing the work. He had responsibilities, he had people to minister to. He had the gospel to share. People were depending on him. And he didn't want to let his fellow believer down. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul describes the Christian attitude. This is the attitude we must have when we've had to say goodbye to someone we love. "I want you to know what will happen to the Christians who have died, so you will not be full of sorrow, like people who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and was raised to life again, we also believe that when Jesus comes, God will bring back with Jesus all the Christians who have died. Not long ago, there was a terrible accident in Utah. They had a fire, a forest fire, and they were battling this blaze, and 8 young firefighters were killed when their van collided with a tractor trailer. In a split second, 8 young men entered into eternity. And a few days later, it was reported that one family not only had lost their 23-year-old son, but 9 years earlier, they had lost another son in a car crash. And the parents were on the Today Show. Matt Lauer was conducting an interview, and if you've seen these interviews, I think it's their goal to get the person that they're interviewing to cry or show some emotion. Maybe they think it's good for the ratings. And so here are the parents, and Matt Lauer is interviewing them, and he asked something like, well, how are you handling this? And this is how they answered. There's just no words to describe it. It's so unfair. We were starting to get over the other one, and now this. Boy, I don't know about you, I can relate to that. There are times when we lose a loved one, and my mother, she died so young, and I remember thinking, this is not